Welcome back to Andersen Acres. Today we're diving into something a little more serious but important for anyone raising ducks. We're talking about a disease called Aspergillosis. It's one of those illnesses that sneaks up on you through the environment. And if you've never heard of it before, don't worry, you're not alone. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what it is, how it affects your ducks, and most importantly, how you can prevent it from showing up in your flock and taking out all your little ducklings. So what exactly is it? What is aspergillosis? Okay. At its core, it's a fungal disease caused by a very specific type of mold. It might sound like a big fancy name, but it's basically just a fungus that thrives in damp, moldy conditions. If you've ever left bread in a bag too long and found that fuzzy green growth, then you know what mold looks like. In your duck's environment, that mold can form on moist bedding or on feed that's gotten damp, and ducks are wet. Okay? Ducks are wet. They get water everywhere. They make everything wet. So mold happens more frequently with ducks than it does with chickens. The problem isn't so much mold you can see with your eyes, though. It's the spores it releases. Ducks will breathe those spores in, and then that's where your trouble begins. Inside the duck's body, those spores travel to their air sacs and their lungs. They can cause plaques or little fungal growths that interfere with breathing. That's why aspergillosis is often referred to as a respiratory disease, even though it's actually caused by a mold. It's not something your ducks can catch from each other, okay? So you're not going to give it from one duck to another. Instead, it's something they pick up from their environment, which makes prevention crucial, okay? Prevention is the way to go here. But let's talk about first who's most at risk, because technically any duck can get aspergillosis, any of them. But ducklings are especially vulnerable. Their immune systems just aren't as strong as adults, and they tend to spend a lot of time close to bedding where spores can build up. They're less adventurous. You see our adults, who are back there, by the way, but you see our adults wander everywhere, and here's some chickens. But you see our adults all over the yard all the time. They're up and down the paths, they're laying on the grass, they like the septic field. They don't spend all their time sitting in the barn. Young ducks, ducklings, and juveniles tend to be a little less adventurous. They tend to want to stick close to home till they get a little older. That means they are more susceptible to things in the environment inside their duck house. In fact, when this disease shows up in chicks and ducklings, sometimes it's just called brooder pneumonia. Okay? Sometimes that's just brooder pneumonia. It's caused by mold and it's not really pneumonia. But that's what they call it because that's where it shows up. Okay. So how do you recognize it? First of all, know that adults can usually fend this off in small doses, but in higher concentrations, well, that's when they have a problem. So usually your grown birds will be okay. Unless they're stressed, okay, then even grown birds can get sick. So unless they're stressed or already ill or have some other reason why they're vulnerable, it's usually not going to hit your adults. It'll hit your ducklings and your juveniles. So how do you recognize aspergillosis then? Aspergillosis. I say it wrong all the time. It doesn't matter. But how do you recognize it if it sneaks into your flock? Well, the main signs are going to be your birds are lethargic and they're starting to have some breathing troubles. A duck with this particular disease may sit off to the side, less active than the others, and it might look like it's just working a little harder to breathe. Maybe it's breathing a little bit faster, or maybe its breathing seems like it's thank you, Lonesome. Maybe its breathing seems like it's just having a hard time getting all the air it needs. Okay, that is a problem. You might notice open mouth breathing or some wheezing or sort of a tail bobbing motion where that tail, where that tail kind of bobs as the bird's trying to get in air. Some ducks will have discharge from their eyes or their nostrils. Others could start losing weight because they just don't feel like eating. When you feel like crud, you kind of don't want to eat. I mean, I'm that way too. A lot of us are. So, very nice. I'm surrounded by birds. Anyway, um, that was Sauron. I've got 3 roosters deciding that they would like to crow at the same time. But yes, so sometimes they lose weight because they don't feel like eating. In severe cases, the membranes of the bill can kind of turn blue. So look inside the mouth and look on top of the beak, the bill. See if there's any hint of blue. That's a sign of oxygen loss. That's a pretty severe case, and you're probably going to need a vet. But tragically, sometimes the first sign is sudden death, especially in young ducklings. That's why it's so important to know what you're looking for before it gets to that point and to do everything you can to prevent it from happening in the first place. Now, if you suspect that your birds have this disease, what can be done? This is where things get tough. Treatment is very challenging. In commercial operations, birds that show signs of this are typically culled. That's because it's really hard to treat. Because once that fungus has taken hold in the lungs, it is so hard to get rid of. So sometimes, in a lot of cases, the best thing that commercial operators can do is just cull the flock. It's not ideal, but sometimes that's what you have to do. For people like us, hobby farmers who have smaller flocks, there are veterinary antifungal medications that can sometimes help, but treatment is long, expensive, and not always successful. So that becomes a judgment call, right? That becomes a judgment call. Do you think it's worth the expense? Sometimes it's not. I would never fault anyone for deciding that a $25 duck is not worth $200 in antifungal medication. But if you're not going to treat and the bird is clearly struggling, then it is best to cull. Either treat or cull. Don't let them suffer. Okay? Suffering's not fair. That's our prerogative. It's our prerogative. It's our job to prevent suffering. And here at Andersen Acres, we never let a bird or any other animal suffer. If you can't treat it, if it's either untreatable or it's financially out of reach or it just doesn't make sense, if it can't be treated and it is making the animal uncomfortable and it's contagious to the rest of the flock, then sometimes culling is your best option. It may not be ideal, but if you're not going to treat, you probably should cull. But the best support you can give to the bird if you are going to treat it is to clean up the environment. Okay? Provide clean air and get your vet's advice on how to keep the dampness at bay, because they will be able to help you if you don't know what you're doing. But I'm going to be honest. Once a bird is showing signs, the prognosis isn't great. Okay? The odds of a full recovery are pretty slim. And that brings us to the most important part of this entire discussion, prevention. If fixing it is going to be so difficult, and it is difficult, let's be fair. So if fixing it is going to be so difficult, preventing it is a better option. So how do we stop Aspergillosis before it even starts? The number one rule is control moisture. I talk about this in relation to a lot of things. I talk about this in regards to frostbite on your chickens, in regards to respiratory diseases in your geese, and all these things. Moisture is a killer. Control moisture. Mold thrives in damp, warm conditions. That means any bedding that gets wet, especially around waterers or after a rain, get rid of it, okay? It's going to mold. Ducks are wet. They get water everywhere. You have to keep them as dry as you can. You're not going to be perfect because ducks are ridiculous with water, but you have to try, okay? You have to try. So the straw or the shavings or whatever bedding you're using needs to be replaced regularly before mold has a chance to grow and cause problems in your flock. Never use bedding that already looks questionable or already got wet, and be extra cautious with hardwood chips that contain bark, because they're especially likely to harbor that mold already, the spores already. If the chips have bark on them, there's a good chance that there's mold on that bark. So don't use them. But feed is another big one. Ducks are messy eaters, and it's easy for water to spill into the feed. I like to keep my food and my water a little ways apart so the feed doesn't get completely soaked, but sometimes it's unavoidable. Any damp feed should be tossed out, okay? Even if you ferment your feed, you know better than to let it mold. Do not let your feed mold, okay? Do not let it mold. If you end up with mold in a feed bin, you can either scrap the whole feed bin or clean it out, scrape every bit of it out, spray it down with vinegar, and leave it in the sun to dry. Vinegar works better than bleach for getting rid of mold. You can also use mold sprays. Bleach will just make the mold not show up. It doesn't really kill a lot of mold. Some molds it will kill, but do yourself a favor, leave it in the sun, because the UV from the sun is really excellent to help you clean up your feed bins. So leave them in full sun. Once you've cleaned them, take the feed out, discard the feed, scrape them down, clean them as well as you can, disinfect them as well as you can on a farm. It's not perfect. And then leave them in the sun to dry. Okay? You want to store any grain you have or any feed you have in dried, sealed containers and make sure it's away from the humidity. You do not want humidity. If you notice any musty smell or any sign of mold or the feed starts to clump, don't risk it. Get rid of the food. If you hatch or brood ducklings, sanitation becomes even more critical. Incubators, brooders, and all the equipment that comes into contact with eggs or ducklings should be disinfected between uses. Mold spores love warm, humid incubators, and without good cleaning, that can build up fast. Good ventilation in your brooding and housing areas is another line of defense. Fresh air reduces the buildup of spores and helps keep your bedding dry. Overcrowding can also make the situation just so much worse. So when ducks are packed too tightly together, the bedding is going to get dirty faster, ventilation suffers, the birds become stressed, they get more water everywhere because they're freaking out. Stress weakens their immune system, which makes them even more likely to succumb if they inhale spores. So give your ducks enough space to move, breathe, and stay dry. This is an important part of keeping them healthy. Now, you might be wondering if Aspergillosis only happens in backyard flocks. No, it happens on quite large scales. There have even been cases in wild ducks and geese. For example, mass die-offs have been recorded when birds ate moldy grain in fields. That shows just how powerful and dangerous this fungus can be when conditions are just right. If it can kill flocks of wild waterfowl, it can certainly threaten our backyard birds if we're not paying enough attention. So let's wrap this up. Aspergillosis is a fungal disease that attacks the lungs and air sacs of ducks. It shows up most often in your ducklings and your juveniles, and symptoms include being really lethargic and having some breathing problems. Treatment is difficult, so prevention is better. By keeping bedding and feed dry, sanitizing your brooders and your incubators, and paying close attention to the overall environment, you can keep your ducks safe from this hidden threat. Now that's about it for me here today at Andersen Acres. Have you ever had to deal with mold in your coop and bedding? Share your experiences in the comments down there. Share some of your own experiences. I'd love to hear how you manage it on your own farm. Thanks for joining me today, and as always, we'll see you tomorrow.